Welcome back to Everyone's Wyatt. I'm your host, Joellen Davidson. Thank you for joining me for our latest episode as my great-grandfather Wyatt Tubert causes family drama before apparently being murdered. You'll learn brand new information, my most disappointing discovery about Wyatt to date. Then Wyatt will reinvent himself for his third era that includes his legal career. This is episode 6, called The Defender. If this is your first time with us, you'll want to start this maze with the first episode. Trust me, go back and start there and we'll hang out while you get caught up. For everyone else, here we go. I took a much-needed break after our last episode to recover from the holidays, write today's episode, and look deeper into something I'll explain shortly. I wonder if anyone finished listening to episode 5 that was named The Runner and thought, I don't get it. How is he the runner in this one? Well, you're not wrong. As I record and edit a show, I have a general outline for the next episode ready, and I use that to name the next episode in my preview. Episode 5 covered a lot, and as I recorded it, I reached a point where I had to choose between making that show over an hour long or taking a pause where I could. Up against a deadline, I chose to pause the story for timing and without realizing, cut off the whole scenario where Wyatt demonstrates as a runner. So, in today's episode, it will become clear why I named episode 5 The Runner and also why I named this one The Defender. We left off shortly after an uneducated Wyatt passed the Indiana bar exam before being arrested for a late-night assault against a man, followed by a one-car accident that put him in the hospital with broken ribs. For reference, at this point, it's 1925. Wyatt is 36 years old, and he only has 10 years left in his life. At this point in the story, one unknown has always been a source of mystery that I accepted as unsolvable simply because records were so hard to find for this time period. Much of the work that went into Wyatt's story focused on official vital records, births, marriages, divorces, and deaths. This information, including the details and dates, is the basis for the fundamentals of genealogy. You must find at least these basics to open the doors to more information about a person you're researching. Well, marriage records for Wyatt to May, Wyatt to Florence, and Wyatt to Margretta, my Nanny Tubert, are all missing. We know he married May only because it was mentioned in the newspaper that they applied for a marriage license. I know they divorced because that was in the paper too. There are more missing official state records from this time period than you can imagine. Years ago, I accepted that we'd never know exactly when these marriages took place, or for that matter, how or when they ended exactly. Everything I would know about this was based only on personal stories, what little there were, from Morgan's Charpaw and My Nanny Tubert. New editions of newspapers are added to archive databases all the time. So at any given moment, a new article mentioning Wyatt can suddenly become available, which is exactly why, even as I tell this story, it's changing. Last summer, for the first time, I found a single Buffalo, New York article that mentioned Wyatt and Florence's divorce with no real context. But I shared it with Morgan because it was our first official hint of divorce, which means there was an official actual marriage, which was always a question for us. We always assumed there was, but unlike with May, we had no proof. And then, as I recorded episode 5, I dug a little deeper with hopes of finding more about the divorce. When I found a brand new detail that filled me with so much disappointment, it almost made me want to quit recording the show. If you recall, I last left you with news of Wyatt's car hitting a telephone pole. Then on August 12, 1925, while every newspaper in Indiana published Wyatt's compliments of the hospital staff, The Fort Wayne Sentinel chose not to publish that story. Instead, they used the same amount of print space in their Wednesday edition to print an alternative headline about Wyatt. The article you're about to hear is the most disappointing news I have about my great-grandfather.
Wife wants divorce. Wyatt Tubert, special agent for the Indiana Division of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, is made defendant in a suit for divorce filed by his wife, Florence Stevens Tubert, in the Miami Circuit Court. Mrs. Tubert alleges her husband often came home intoxicated and that he often struck and cursed her. At the time of their separation, March 31st, it is alleged Tubert drew a loaded revolver on his wife and threatened to kill her. The couple were married in 1919 and have 3 children.
The mystery of Wyatt and Florence's marriage and divorce never involved abuse, as far as we knew. But this narrative tracks, given Wyatt's recent personality changes as he spent more time in the bottle. For the first time, I had insight on Florence's feelings, and I could suddenly empathize with her as a wife. I didn't want to get on here and paint a picture of my great-grandfather, the man who abused his wife. Believe me, it's the last thing I want the world to know about him, and frankly, I'm glad Nanny never knew that part. In this moment, I think about some of my family members who are listening to this, the ones who listen with their kids or their spouses to this show, about an adventurous, ambitious man. It's moments like this when the story of Wyatt would be easier for me to tell if I thought only strangers were listening. I'm ashamed to report this particular fact about Wyatt as his great-granddaughter, as a woman, and as a survivor of violent abuse. I had a moment during the break from recording where I thought about skipping this detail, but I promised truth. And as the only person, other than Wyatt, who knows the whole story right now, I can honestly say that the best part of Wyatt's story is yet to come. I'm grappling with deciding if I forgive his behavior toward Florence, but I had to continue the show because the Wyatt era we're about to jump into is going to unravel a tangled mess of mystery that is nonstop from this moment until Wyatt's death. Both of them. We've reached that point in the story that I've teased a few times in previous episodes. Soon you'll hear how Wyatt was murdered for the first time. Especially if you're related to me, you may be asking how I could possibly question if Wyatt and Florence were married or divorced, since I already knew he went on to marry my great-grandmother later. Well, let's play a game. You decide. Given what you'll hear in the next few minutes, if you could accept the facts about him without proof. Here are some of the clues I was dealing with at the time. Florence's gravestone in New Haven reads Florence M. Stevens, wife of Wyatt Evans Tubert Sr. So, at the time of her death, many years later, she still saw herself as his wife. Or at least that's what we assumed. And then there's a memory that Morgan's Charpaw, otherwise known as Charles, shared about Wyatt and Florence, his parents. Here's a clip that I've pulled from my recent conversation with Morgan that you heard in an earlier episode. I just couldn't reveal this part because it was too early in the timeline to tell this part of the story. Here you go. Tell that story. I love that story.
Okay, so I, being the only grandchild and always into history and family stuff and ancestry, even as a young kid before I knew what ancestry and genealogy was, I always was very inquisitive about where we come from. Were we from Germany? You know, always asking these nerd questions, I guess, even as a kid. And my grandpa had been into ancestry. He had ordered like a genealogy booklet of the Tuberts. And I actually still have it here in my home office. But anyway, I think maybe he had gotten that in the mail and that prompted the conversation. And I asked him then, so tell me about I know about all about grandma's family, but I don't ever hear you say anything about yours. What happened to your mom and dad? Well, my mom died when she was young and, her family was from Ireland, but they grew up in Connecticut. Okay, well, that's the Stevens. Well, what about your dad? Well, he was murdered. I said, oh, wow. When? Well, when I was very, very young. Well, but from who? Well, he was a special agent for the railroad. And he was murdered in a robbery gone bad on the railroad one day. That was a thing back then in the 20s. And, they had these railroad, train car robberies, and there was a shootout, and he never came home. And my grandpa told me he had a distinct visual, like core memory of someone coming to the door, telling his mom and his older brother, who, by the way, was also Wyatt Tubert, that someone had come to the door. His older brother, Wyatt, had answered, and he just heard his mom fall to her knees and scream and crying. And it scared my grandpa so much that he ran and hid under his bed, and that his older brother came in there and ended up telling him, and so did his mom, that their dad wasn't coming home. He'd been murdered in a train robbery. And so I always had, Wyatt in my mind as this hero, who died trying to protect, you know, the citizens on this train. And he was this military guy that was this special agent, and he was this attorney. And my grandpa ended up being a lawyer, and I think he got
Right.
that because he was wanted to maybe follow in his father's footsteps. But we always regarded him, at least me in my mind, as this hero that was taken too soon. And that's what my grandpa told me. Now, I was a kid, and unfortunately, he's been deceased many years, so I can't ask him now if that was just something he said and he actually did know the truth, or if that was something that he really thought was the truth and he never had any suspicions otherwise.
Yeah. Let's unpack that a little further. This is a detail that Morgan and I first discussed 16 years ago. We've based a lot of what we assume about Wyatt on this memory. An additional detail is that the train robbery where Wyatt was believed to be murdered was said to be in Ashland, Kentucky, which happens to be my hometown. When Morgan heard this story from Charles many years ago, she could have never guessed that story from her grandfather would be the pinpoint at which her life and mine would converge, even that many years before we were both born. Obviously, Wyatt wasn't murdered that day, but his 3 children with Florence grew up and even passed away, believing their father was murdered in this Ashland train robbery. Morgan and I have spoken about this train robbery story many times, trying to guess the motivation behind it and the truth hidden between the lines. The most logical conclusion we found includes evidence we have proving Florence knew without a doubt Wyatt wasn't dead, because she visits his family in West Virginia multiple times with Wyatt Jr. tagging along in the coming years, and the family definitely knew he was alive. We also know Florence was very close with Wyatt's brother Arthur, which is who I believe came to the door that night. Oddly enough, Wyatt was in Ashland at this time, but there was no train robbery. There was, however, my great-grandmother. I believe Arthur showed up in person to deliver the news during Florence and Wyatt's separation that his brother was involved with a new woman. I guess technically he betrayed Wyatt, but good for him. This was the final nail in the coffin of Wyatt's marriage to Florence, as he became dead to her as a husband. Why not go ahead and kill him off, figuratively of course, as she delivered the news to the children and anyone else that Wyatt was killed in a train robbery. In that time, after all, it was more acceptable to be a widow with 3 children than a divorcee. This also makes me wonder if Florence did know about his estrangement from his daughters with May. If so, Florence would have had no reason to believe Wyatt would ever be back, even for his kids. Florence and her children relocated to New Haven, Connecticut. And the new woman? Well, that was my great-grandmother, my nanny's mother, Margretta Amon. They met at the train station where she worked as a transcriptionist. I believe he was the love of her life. And as far as we know, based on what little she spoke of him, she never knew about any of his 5 existing children. I'll have more information about how some of his children intersect into my family in a later episode.
The best-kept secret in Kentucky real estate is EMB Mortgage Group, a division of Pro Mortgages, which has been around for 50 years. EMB Mortgage Group offers home loans for just about every housing scenario you could have. You know they're doing something right when 90% of EMB Mortgage Group's business starts with a referral from past clients or realtors they've worked with for years. Applying is easy at embkentucky.com or call the owner directly at 859-200-2709. An experienced loan officer based in Lexington will customize a home loan and guide you through the unique steps of your mortgage. Again, that's embkentucky.com or call 859-200-2709. Give them a call. Equal Housing Lender, NMLS 2071, Lexington, Kentucky.
His home base was still in Indiana, but Wyatt's position he held as a railroad special agent often took him to the Ashland hub. While maintaining his job at the railroad, by April 1926, he had also accepted a position at the Peru, Indiana law firm of Jenkins and Jenkins. One of his early cases involved filing a restraining order against contractors on behalf of 500 citizens who opposed the installation of a mile-long flood wall. He defended the position of these citizens worried about the dredging of the river's edge and how it would affect the town. Back home in West Virginia, the extended Tubert family was experiencing the first of several tragic events to come. Wyatt's Aunt Ada Mae, who was his mother Ella Jane's sister, was killed. She was traveling home to visit her brother Henry in the hospital. She safely arrived by train in Gauley Bridge, although the train didn't commonly stop there. It was a special courtesy stop for her emergency visit. She was described as hysterical when she got off the train in the dark. But back then, women were often described as hysterical in the paper any time they expressed the slightest concern about anything. It was dark, and she was alone. Of course she'd be uncomfortable. A construction contractor working nearby had 2 of his workers escort Ada Mae across the bridge, lighting the way for her until she reached the other side. She proceeded while the men went back across the bridge, when, for reasons unknown, Ada Mae fell over the embankment and hit a rock, killing her instantly. Other than the description of her death, the newspaper used print space to mention she was the aunt of Special Agent W.E. Tubert. Side note, I believe if this happened in 2026 and not 1926, we'd be investigating those 2 men. My spidey senses are on high red alert on this one, but I can't find anything saying there was any suspicion. A sign of the times, in my opinion. A few months later, in April 1927, Wyatt, who had been a practicing attorney for less than 1 year, decided to throw his hat in the ring and run for county prosecutor. Because why not? It's not like he had anything else going on in his life. So, if you're keeping score, Wyatt is running from his family and running for office. And even though he doesn't know it yet, is running out of time, with only 8 short years left in his life. He didn't win that election, by the way, but he did submit news of his running to the newspapers back home in West Virginia. And in true Wyatt fashion, he exaggerated a bit. A huge write-up about his aspirations for office included false details, including that he studied law at Yale. Didn't happen. I verified it with the university. He had only a high school diploma. The article also said, and I quote, "During Navy service, he visited practically every country in the civilized world." Come on. Yes, his boat went to Europe and the Caribbean. It's kind of funny. During that same year, Wyatt officially transferred to Ashland. He and Florence were now divorced, and he was fully involved with Margretta. In fact, according to her personal records, not the state's records, They married in May of 1927 and settled in Catlettsburg, a small town just outside Ashland and barely 3 miles from her parents' home. That summer, June of 1927, Wyatt and 52 other men sat for the Kentucky State Bar exam. Among those men was the sitting Kentucky Governor William J. Fields. Both the governor and Wyatt passed that exam. As Wyatt continued his career as a railroad special agent, he kept busy over the next year arresting check forgers, train robbers, and trespassers. The summer of 1928 brought change and more drama to Wyatt and Margretta Tubert and his extended family in West Virginia. In June, a man named Clell Copley struck Wyatt in the head as he tried to keep Wyatt from wrestling away his gun. The gun went off, but fortunately never hit anyone. Wyatt was, however, injured and hospitalized from his head injury, from which he recovered quickly. Soon after, Wyatt was transferred back to Hinton, West Virginia, where he was beloved by the community. The very week Wyatt arrived back in Hinton, it was announced that the county bank account was overdrawn by $10,000, which meant Wyatt's job was going to be harder, as all the county funds previously available to the railroad for prosecuting trespassing and other cases were put on hold. He didn't let it slow down his arrests. Instead of county or state charges, those arrested by Wyatt were brought up on federal charges, usually involving robbery. Railroad land is federal land, after all. Wyatt and his officers slowed down the crime along the Hinton Railroad immediately with this strategy, even traveling to other parts of the state to make arrests of 5 men who had stolen loot of a combined value of thousands of dollars. And that's why Hinton loved some Special Agent Tubert. When crime on the railroad was slow, crime in the town tended to slow down too. Before 1928 wrapped up, Wyatt's sister Thelma and his uncle Joe were injured in a car wreck in Charleston when they were hit head-on by a speeding vehicle that had lost control. You may remember Uncle Joe from episode 1 of this podcast, talking about his time on Tubert Farm. Wyatt and Margretta rushed to Charleston to be by their side, as Thelma suffered a broken jaw and nose, injured eyes, and bruises throughout her body. Uncle Joe fractured his spine, had 4 broken ribs, and some internal injuries. While it was a scary event for the family, both recovered. Wyatt started 1929 hailed as a hero to a small boy in Hinton. Wyatt and his partner, Officer Kyle Maddie, were driving behind an ice cream truck. Just as they noticed a small boy was riding on the back bumper of the truck, the boy fell off. Wyatt and Officer Maddie stopped and immediately picked up the boy, taking him to the hospital for treatment.
If you are enjoying this podcast, we ask that you consider making a donation to our favorite charity. Embracing Community is a Kentucky nonprofit that is currently raising funds for 2 projects. Help elderly Kentuckians pay their gas or electric bill this winter, or contribute to a fund to provide scholarships for trade school students in the Bluegrass. Go to embracingcommunity.org for more information and to make a donation. Any proceeds from the Everyone's Wyatt podcast will also be donated to Embracing Communities Fund, so please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube, rate and review, and share with your friends. Let's help Kentucky get ahead with Embracing Community.
In February, tragedy fell upon the Tubert family as news spread that Wyatt's little brother Waitman was missing and presumed dead as he fell from a boat in the Kanawha River. First, I want to point out that the headline wasn't "Drowning Kills Local Man" or "Man Missing from Drowning" or something like that. The headlines in every newspaper in West Virginia was "Brother of W.E. Tubert Drowned." Waitman worked for the Appalachian Power Company and was in what the newspaper called a flatboat. I'm not sure if they meant a small barge or a large pontoon type of boat, but it was anchored to a very large boat. As a worker pulled up the anchor to go ashore, the larger boat it was connected to began to rock. causing Waitman's boat to take on water. The two men stayed on the boat until it sunk, then attempted to swim ashore. Waitman, who was wearing very heavy winter clothing since it was a cold February, was caught up in the swift current and could not make it to the riverbank. He was last seen fighting the current as the river's bend took him from sight. His co-worker was able to grab a rock to save himself, though he was hospitalized for exposure and pneumonia. Wyatt rushed home to Golly Bridge, where he remained to lead and direct the search for his little brother, who was presumed dead. After 10 days, a grieving Wyatt offered a $100 reward to anyone able to recover Waitman's body. Ella Jane, Wyatt and Waitman's mother, was so grief-stricken that she was hospitalized, adding to both Wyatt's concern and determination. After more than 2 weeks, Wyatt himself was hospitalized with the flu. Waitman's body was finally found 14 miles down the river after 3 months, and identified only by the watch he was wearing. He was only 24 years old and left behind not only his mother and siblings, but also his wife Sarah and their 1-year-old son named Jack. On June 8th, Wyatt wrote a tribute poem for Waitman, which was published in the Hinton Daily News.
To the memory of W.W. Tubert, drowned February 9th, 1929. Dearest little baby brother, in your dark and silent tomb, hours are passing, swiftly passing, when we shall join you in the gloom. Down a swiftly flowing river, when you made that race with death. Are you thinking of us, brother, as death took your final breath? We miss you, oh, we miss you, as each evening finds you gone. But we shall hurry, little brother, and join you in that home.
Wyatt had no idea just how soon he would be joining Waitman. I'm not sure where he found the time to prepare, but Wyatt took the West Virginia bar exam just 1 month later and passed. He's now 40 years old and has been admitted to the Bar Association of Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. After a year of budget constraints limiting Wyatt to who he can and can't charge with crimes in Hinton, his frustration led him to write a letter to the editor of the Hinton Daily News, defending the responsibility and duties of his police force.
I've had brought to my attention an article which appeared in the Hinton Independent Herald on September 5th, headed Feeding Prisoners. This article, I understand, as prepared by one of our county officials, whose salary is largely paid by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. The officers of C&O do not spend their entire time arresting trespassers, but among our prisoners there will be found men charged and convicted of serious crimes, such as murder, burglary, robbery, grand larceny, and a great many of whom we arrest are not charged with acts against the railway, but to the contrary, store robbery, post office robbery, and for injuries against the citizens who live along our lines. It appears to me that the C&O Railway Company, which is the largest taxpayer in Summers County, is entitled to the same consideration that is given to every other citizen. Yours very truly, W.E. Tubert, Division Special Agent.
At this point, Margretta, my great-grandmother, who I always knew as a child as Nanny Tubert, was pregnant with my nanny, Wyatt's sixth child. Shortly before her birth, it was announced that Wyatt and Margretta were headed to Peru, Indiana, as Wyatt was trading jobs at C&O again to head up the Chicago division based in Peru. And then, from Peru, the Tuberts announced the birth of their new baby daughter. If you're a family member of mine, listen up, because you won't believe what the announcement said. Mr. and Mrs. W.E. Tubert of Peru, Indiana, but former residents of Hinton, West Virginia, announced the birth of a 6-pound baby daughter, February 5th. Mother and baby are getting along nicely. The baby has been born Maud Joanna. That's right. For those not related to me, I'll explain why that's weird. Nanny's name was never Maud. Her legal name was simply Joanne Tubert, later Joanne Renfro. It's on her birth certificate as such. But I'll let you know that I actually showed and read this to Nanny when I found it years ago, and we had a huge laugh. She said to me, "I feel like I would have had a different life if I was a mod. I'm glad they changed their mind." She was so cute. It's 1930, and Wyatt now has 2 failed marriages, greatly because of his behavior and prioritizing career over family. He had a pattern of leaving town every time a new child was born and staying gone. This time, perhaps he wanted it to be different, as he resigned from C&O less than 2 months after Nanny was born. Wyatt, Margretta, and Joanne were headed back to Margretta's hometown and mine of Ashland, Kentucky, where he also settled into a quiet legal career. When I say quiet, I mean Wyatt went through an almost 2-year period of absolutely no mentions in the newspaper or any other documentation of his movements. I have no choice, knowing what I know, but to call this the calm before the storm. In 1931, back in West Virginia, something was not right, and Ella Jane Hara, Wyatt's mother, noticed. She wrote a letter to the editor about a large number of ambulances mysteriously and often appearing at a work site near Hawksnest, West Virginia, where a tunnel was being drilled for a future hydroelectric power plant. Immediately after, her husband Stuart Hara was fired from that electric company. A few months later, in 1932, Ella found an urgent need to contact Wyatt, her attorney's son, because her friend Mrs. Jones was faced with the serious lung-related illnesses of her 2 sons and her brother. And she had just lost her youngest son after he had the same symptoms. You might be asking, Wyatt's an attorney, not a doctor. What would she want with him? All 4 of these men were working the same job as drillers at shaft number 1 at the very tunnel at Hawksnest where those ambulances kept appearing. As I said, something wasn't right, and Wyatt was now on his way to get to the bottom of it. Next time on Everyone's Wyatt. One of the worst industrial disasters in the U.S. happened at Hawksnest Hydroelectric Tunnel Project in West Virginia, and I grew up barely 100 miles away, never knowing a thing about it, much less that I had close ties to it through my great-grandfather. Now, I know probably more than I should because of him and my investigation inspired by his involvement with the help of my Nanny Tubert. Prepare yourself for the next part of Wyatt's story ripe with controversy, lies, conspiracy, greed, and as far as I'm concerned, Wyatt's redemption and legacy. I hope you'll join me next time for episode 7 called The Advocate. And here's a little bonus preview for you of more things to come. In future episodes of this podcast, I'll give you updates that go beyond Wyatt himself. You'll learn more about many of the characters you have heard and will hear about in this story. You'll also hear interviews with family members about their take on the story after finally hearing it, plus one in particular who was the closest to Margretta other than my nanny. Speaking of Margretta, did you know she had a second mysterious husband? I'll tell you about him. Also, I'll fill you in on a completely separate dramatic family tale that ultimately led to the day my nanny accidentally met her sister without knowing it. When Wyatt's story soon ends, in our journey here, the story continues. I look forward to sharing it all with you here on Everyone's Wyatt.
This episode of Everyone's Wyatt, originally published February 8, 2026, is dedicated to Joanne Tubert Renfro on her birthday week of what would have been her 96th year. No one was more invested in this story, and we at Moon Media have no doubt Joanne is folding her arms and tapping a foot right next to Wyatt as she watches it unfold in this podcast. This one's for you, Nanny.
Everyone's Wyatt is a production of Moon Media. Researched, written, and edited by Jo Ellen Davidson. Music by Homer V. Sparks.